Welcome to Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times, presented by Worth Wealth Management, a weekly conversation with area leaders about how to persevere during uncertain times. Now here's your host, Gary Shorman.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times. Our program faces a little different challenge today when you talk about challenging times. Things happen in Washington that seem like a long ways away until they happen to someone right here in Hays or our part of the world. Our guest today is Sam Fogelsong, whose family was hit by the recent cuts that were made by Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency. Our guest is Sam, and Sam is a scholar of African studies and a writer who lives here in Hays. He and his family moved here around about a year ago, but they were hit by the cuts that Elon Musk made, and that all of a sudden is changing and making a challenging time for their family. Welcome to our show, Sam.
Thank you for having me, Gary. It's a pleasure to be on.
You know what? Washington seems like a long way away, but it wasn't in this case. Tell me a little bit about your story and what happened, because you moved here for a job opportunity, correct? Or your wife's job opportunity?
Yeah. My spouse's job opportunity. We moved here back in, it was March 8th, so just about exactly a year ago. And things were going great for the first year. We're loving Hays, enjoying sort of the break in small town, moving into a small town, that is. And then obviously the new administration came in, and we sort of pretty much since the inauguration, things started to change, which at least for me, and I think many other federal employees who received these sort of notices and eventually were terminated could sort of attest to that. There was a real climate of disrespect, both leading up to the terminations, that most of which occurred on the 13th of February, but also the way in which these terminations were conducted was sort of very disrespectful, at least in my eyes. I think the first thing would essentially be, it all started with this original email sort of titled Fork in the Road, which shared the same title that Elon Musk titled his email to thousands of Twitter employees that he laid off back when he took over that company. And this email laid out an opportunity to do a sort of deferred resignation program, which allowed employees to type resign into the body of the email, which sort of seemed a bit suspicious. And you would then be paid full salary until September 2025. So essentially 8 months pay. We considered it, but it didn't really seem like an honest offer. There was no sort of federal guarantee. There was no law ensuring this was the case. And I may be wrong about this, but my understanding is that some federal employees who were probationary employees, as my wife was, that is, people who were within their first year to 2 years of service, took the offer only to discover afterwards that probationary employees were actually not eligible to receive this offer. But generally, these sort of constant emails that were being delivered directly into the mailboxes of individual workers, sort of, at least from the emails I read, sort of had these sort of veiled threats, or sort of were directed at or hoping to create a sort of environment or a climate of uncertainty and really suspicion amongst the federal workers. And I mean, that comes sort of amidst rhetoric coming from the administration, both from Doge and political pundits, people with inside Trump's cabinet, that sort of really contributed to this hostility. So I was listening to a lot of stuff, and I would hear phrases like parasites, bloodsuckers. A senator from Texas, referred to all federal employees as sort of passengers on the gravy train. And this is not sort of individual, departments or sort of potentially bad actors. This is painting with broad strokes. And I wrote, yeah.
So Sam, before we'll talk about what you had a editorial that was in our company's online newspaper.
Yeah.
But tell me what your wife did at the National Resource and Conservation Service.
So yeah, she was an archaeologist with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So as were a couple other people in Hays and around the state of Kansas. There were quite a few archaeologists who were swept up in the layoffs. But so she would essentially work with tribal organizations, but also predominantly with farmers. So essentially, the way I understand often this works with archaeologists is a farmer seeking to implement a new practice, whether that's a new well or easements or terraces, can get federal funding to do so, but there are laws sort of protecting Native American burials, Native American sites, or even historical sites from pioneers, etc. And so archaeologists have to come out and survey the land and sort of ensure that there are no sort of archaeological artifacts or potentially even burials there before this practice can go ahead and before funding can be released to the farmers. So certainly, I think a lot of farmers are struggling at the moment because there's this sort of hitch in the program where there's nobody to come out and do the surveying. And so the sort of process has been greatly interrupted.
So one of the things, she moves out here. Where'd you guys move from?
We actually moved from, we're both originally from Salt Lake City, but we had been living in England in the UK for the 3 years. So that was another great transition from going from England to small town Hayes was a pretty big move.
But you know, that's one of the things that you look at and you're going, you know, you guys moved halfway around the world to get here for
Yeah.
a job, and then everything turns upside down that way. The idea of how the whole process took place, you outline in your editorial.
Yeah.
Talk about that editorial and the response you received to that, both good and bad.
Yeah, thank you for the question. There was a lot of positive comments, many of which were people who had been laid off themselves, or people were just expressing their sympathy. But a lot of people who were sort of negative or critical of the article seemed to express sort of a lack of sympathy, but based mostly, this is what was so interesting, is almost everybody used this phrase, learn to code, which is referencing a moment in 2019 when President Biden told coal miners on the campaign trail, you know, if you can, he said, I think, if you can go down 3,000 feet in a coal mine, you can darn well learn to code, which is really insulting and frivolous. And I understand their anger at that. But what is sort of bizarre to me is that in another world, perhaps when we're not so divided along partisan lines, we would all come together and say, hey, we share this sense of being wronged by politicians and elites. But now it sort of seems that whenever something like this happens, people are just satisfied with the fact that the other side is now hurting rather than developing a sense of camaraderie and sort of saying, well, we need to make our politicians work for us and not treat us so carelessly.
What about what are your feelings about the Department of Government Efficiency? What would you like to see from them? You know, there are ways we need to improve our government because we have to, you know, we've got to find a
Sure,
way to
yeah.
balance the budget. But in this particular case, what would you like to see from them that would have made this process any better?
Um, I think I'd say, ironically, I'd say more efficiency. So, I mean, you were worked in leadership roles for a long time. You were CEO of Eagle Media, as I understand it. I think part of my issue with this, at least looking at sort of the department that my wife worked for, was noticing that all of these emails and the communications, and even when all these employees were eventually fired, they were told directly into their email box, which often left people in leadership positions within these departments. They had no idea that this was happening. And so I know that my wife's boss had very little information to offer his employees who were heartbroken and had their lives turned upside down about what exactly was going on. Um, and I think that sort of is sort of a microcosm of Doge as a whole, is that it's operating sort of really recklessly. They're just sort of cutting things without a sort of general plan. And I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of reducing the federal workforce or sort of making cuts or making things more efficiently. I don't think anybody is actually against that. I think what people are saying is the way in which it's being done could be greatly improved. For example, under Bill Clinton, 270,000 employees were let go, but it was a 3 year process. They had a 6 month committee of 250 people who sort of designed what they wanted the government to look like afterwards. They were holding sort of big meetings, town hall type meetings with federal employees to discuss their grievances and their ideas. They were given a bailout of $25,000 that was approved by Congress unanimously, bipartisanly. And this is just none of the things that I'm seeing from Doge. It seems like not only reckless, but also careless and indifferent to sort of the impact that many of these cuts are having on people's lives, like my own, and my wife's and many of my friends.
Have there been any changes since the initial emails that you received? Because I know the Department of Agriculture had some merit systems rulings that came out. Has that changed anything for you?
It has. And so, yes, I think it was the 5th of March, The Merit Systems Protection Board ruled that the firings were at least initially unlawful. I'm not sure about the specifics of the ruling, but they ruled that all 6,000 USDA probationary employees who were let go across the country are to be placed in pay status, and were to receive back pay from the date of termination. And I think essentially their argument is that reductions in force or RIFs happen all the time, but the way this was done was supposed to be a RIF, but they didn't follow RIF procedures. And I think the linchpin in this whole decision is in the email that fired all of these federal employees, they had a sentence, which I include in my editorial, that says, "We find based on your performance that your continued employment would not be in the public service," which I think speaks to my arguments about the inefficiency of DOGE, is so that because they were sort of reckless and perhaps even so desiring in sort of in line with their sort of troll kind of attitude towards this whole endeavor, they added in this line about people's performance, which is sort of insulting, especially given that many employees have stellar performance reviews. And the net result of not following this procedure or doing things recklessly is that 6,000 USDA employees are going to be receiving a month's salary for having done nothing, for having sat at home. So that's the most recent update. We still think that the reduction in force will go forward in the coming weeks. There's no guarantees, but ultimately right now, my wife is being paid a salary, but is not working for the USDA, which speaks volumes about the inefficiency. As much she would love to be working and doing the work that she's passionate about, but
that makes an interesting twist to that. Does she work from
yeah,
home or does she work in an office here in Hayes?
she works from an office.
Okay. So all of this goes through our program, talks about leadership in challenging times. Yours is with your family. It's going to be hard to change what goes on in Washington. It's a long
Sure,
ways away.
yeah.
You're working and really defending your family and the process that went through. But what do you do next as a family? What do you do as a husband in this particular role to take the next step?
I think be positive and look for new opportunities. But ultimately, I think when a big life change happens, especially an unexpected one, is to see it as a gift rather than an insult, and to not focus on the personal injury and say, well, perhaps this is an opportunity to pursue something else. So my wife and I are both interested in pursuing further graduate studies. So we thought, if this comes down, why not use this as an excuse to sort of say, all right, life has given us a shakeup that we couldn't plan on. Maybe we sort of use that energy to propel us into a new direction. But ultimately, positivity is absolutely the key. We are not in control of this, and waking up each day and be grateful for, as cheesy as it is, for the breath in your lungs and the day the sun is shining. And granted, at the same time, not everybody can say that, right? There's a lot of people who are struggling a lot more than my wife and I. We have resources and there's other jobs and we don't have children, but people who are far more over leveraged or who have families or have a single income are really hurting. And so I think saying, yes, let's be positive is great, but not everybody has the ability to sort of have such a positive outlook.
Boy, Dan, I love that. I want to come back and talk a little bit more about that and some of what you learned moving from England to here to the Midwest. And so stay with me right here. Dan Fogelberg is our guest today, and he's gone through the whole process of the Government Department of Efficiency. Family is involved with the recent cuts, but a great wrap up there as to kind of how you look at it from his and his wife's point of view. We're going to take a quick break here, be back with more after this on Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times.
Since 1776, the United States of America continues to stand tall. It's been tested before, many times. Through grit and the ability to move forward, we create better tomorrows. We help our clients live their best lives to and through retirement. We make it easier. Thank you, Kansas. Worth Wealth Management, enhancing lives and strengthening families.
Welcome back to our program, Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times with Sam Fogelsong. You moved here a year ago, really about right now, from England to Hayes, Midwest U.S. what did you find? I mean, forget the stuff that's going on, hard to do. You're right in the middle of it. But what did you find moving to a Midwestern town from, halfway across the world?
First, a small correction. It's Sam Fogelsong.
Vogelsong. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no problem.
Thank you.
I've
Thank you.
struggled with my name my entire life, so don't worry about it.
There's another Fogelberg out there, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a couple.
Yeah. So Sam Fogelsong is our guest here. I apologize for that. Slip of tongue comes every once
no
in a
worries.
while. But what did you find after moving from England here? And what did you learn?
I think the first observation would just be sort of the great expanse of the plains. Living in England and living in Europe for 3 years as we did, everything is so hemmed in. You almost rarely get to sort of just let your eyes go on the horizon. And I remember fondly driving in from, Denver when we first moved here and just seeing, great open fields of grain and the old grain silos. And it made me, as somebody who grew up in Utah and loves hiking in the outdoors, it made me feel relaxed. I think there's a sort of anxiety that I get being in a big city. So we definitely enjoyed that. And then coming into the small town, I enjoy the sort of slow pace of things. People are generally polite and friendly, which I don't know if you know anything about England, but often there's sort of like a terse sort of attitude that people have with strangers sometimes. So that was pleasant. It was a big shakeup, obviously moving here. I think in England, we enjoyed the privileges of universal healthcare and a sense of sort of having a sort of greater safety network provided for by the state. And moving to Kansas, not having health insurance was a big concern initially, and just sort of the cost of things. The price of living in the U.S. is really, really high. The price of groceries was a big shock to us. And then obviously another shock was just socially, right? We had a big group of friends, and you have to sort of slowly start to establish a network of people, many of which came from my spouse's office.
Well, it's a challenging time, I know, for you and your wife going through this, and certainly as someone who has a family, you feel for what you guys are going through. And I hope is over the next few months and weeks, you keep us posted on what your next adventure is going to be, because you both seem like very responsible and very enthusiastic, and frankly, you have a great attitude going into this. The education process, obviously, there's good schools here and other things as well. So I hope you keep in touch with us and keep us posted on your progress on your next step.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that's
our guest today on Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times, is Sam Fogelsong. And we've been talking about some of the cuts being made in Washington, D.C. that have a real influence and touch people right here in Hays. And this is just not one story, but there's others as well. Our program, Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times, is brought to you by Worth Wealth Management, where you can live with confidence. I'm Gary Shorman.
Thanks for joining us for Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times, presented by Worth Wealth Management. Join us right here next week for another episode with host Gary Shorman. Until then, remember to move forward ever, backward never.